Welcome to Lesson 4 of the AQS Let's Quilt series, and this is our beginning quilt making class. Okay, so I hope you have all of your blocks sewn together, 4 of block A, 8 of block B, and 4 of block C, because today we're going to add the sashing both between the blocks and then between the rows. Golly, we're really coming along. But we want to thank our sponsors, and so here's a short message from 2 of our sponsors.
A machine with endurance is important. That's why I own the Janome Continental M7. Janome, reliability by design.
So now we are ready to sew the sashing strips to our quilt blocks. But before we do that, you can see that behind me now I have a design wall up. And you know, you can make a design wall that's very portable, so it doesn't have to be a permanent design wall hanging on one of the walls in your house. It can be something that you pin to a curtain, but let me tell you how I made it. This is 2 yards of 60-inch wide 100% cotton flannel. It has a nap on it, and so everything you see hanging on that design wall behind me is just stuck up there by pressing it into the flannel. But you don't even have to buy 2 yards of flannel like I did. You can use a flannel-backed tablecloth. A lot of us use those for our picnic tables. Vinyl on one side, flannel on the other. And so you can make yourself a design wall very easy. And you can see how nice it is to be able to put all of those blocks up on the wall and make sure you have them turned right. And I can just tell you, when Alan and I put those on the wall, we had one of the rows upside down. So save yourself some trouble of sewing your blocks together incorrectly. Now, the first thing we have to do is measure our blocks. And they should finish 12.5 inches. But there are some factors that maybe, if yours doesn't measure 12.5 inches, there are some factors that cause that. Sometimes it might be just a fraction of an inch off on the seam allowance, and as long as you're doing the same seam allowance consistently, it will not affect your quilt. Also, it could be the turn of the fabric, and by turn of the fabric, I mean when we turn that seam allowance under, this navy blue fabric is just a tad bit heavier than the solid lavender fabric, and so sometimes that will make a difference. So we're going to measure my blocks and we'll see how they come out. Okay, I'm going to use the 12.5-inch ruler from AccuQuilt, their Go ruler. So this is a good use for that 12.5-inch ruler, is to measure these blocks. Now, we know it should measure 12.5 inches, but we'll find out. We're going to measure my block. So I'm going to lay the edges of this ruler all the way around. And what do I find? But my block actually measures 12 3/8 inches. And if yours measures that or something different, that's okay, because what will make it all fit together is that's why we haven't cut these sashing strips yet. So I cut mine 2.5 inches wide and 12 3/8 inches long, so they exactly fit the edges of my blocks. So now it's time to sew some sashing. And while we do that, we'll hear from our sponsors.
Scissorman here, founder of Fomori Cutlery. Chances are, if you're watching this, you're a needle artist. And needle artists like yourself from around the world have trusted the Fomori brand as their preferred cutting instruments for the past 20 years. To learn more, go to famcut.com.
Okay, so now we've cut our sashing strips and we're going to sew them between the blocks in a row. I've laid out row 1 here on my table, And it's real easy once you pick a block up to sew something on the wrong side. So I do one of these little tricks where I'm going to put a pin in this block and a pin in this block. And now I know when I'm ready to sew the sashing strip on, this is the edge I have to sew it on. Just remember that, because after you've sewn a complicated quilt and turned some blocks around, you'll wish you'd done that. So I'm going to take my sashing strip, and now I don't need one on the end. I need one on here. And again, this is one of the few times that I use a pin. And I'm going to align the corner with the sashing and the block. I'm going to go to the other corner and I'm going to put another pin in. Because you want to make sure those are sewn in there accurately. And now I'm going to take the block and I'm going to go like that, and I'm going to put one pin in the center. And so now I'm ready to sew that strip on. And I never sew over pins, so right before you get to that pin, once you've had some stitches sewn into it, I'm going to pull the pin. And again, can you see the light touch that I have just guiding that fabric to make sure that it just rides right along the edge of the presser foot? Now, I will warn you that one of the places that it's real easy to get your seam allowances off is as you're getting down here to this end. And so I'm just going to take my finger and keep it on there as long as I can while I'm finishing, and not let go until you get right there, to make sure that that seam allowance stays 1/4 of an inch. Okay, let's go ahead and press these as we go. And again, I will take the iron and set the seam. I'm going to press the seam allowance toward the sashing, and the reason I'm going to do that is because we have all of these seams, and so you got 4 layers of fabric there and 4 layers of fabric right here, and it will just lay better if I press the seam allowance toward the seam of the sashing. So again, I'm just going to press from the top, and that one's all done. And now you can see that every time I bring it back and lay it in position, we'll sew the strip to this one. And again, I'm going to pin, and we'll sew. And we'll lay it back in place. And now it's just a matter of laying block 2 over on block 1. And I like to sew with the plain fabric on top. So I'm going to pin this so that I can sew on the sashing and then just not have to worry about those seam allowances going through the sewing machine. You'll notice that the pattern, I chose this 9-patch block pattern primarily because it's one of the most used block designs, and you can do a lot of things with it. You could piece some of these squares in the block. You can see by pinning how fast this seam goes. With just that little bit of seam, and you just want to make sure your seam allowances stay in the right direction underneath. Okay, we have the first 2 blocks sewn together, and you would just continue that same method for sewing the whole row together. And we're going to take a short break for more of our sponsors, and when we come back, we're going to sew the sashing strip that goes between the rows.
Tracy's Tables has all of your custom sewing table needs. Visit tracystables.com to see the complete line of unique tables, carts, and shelves. And all of Tracy's Tables are made in the USA. Trust the quality of Coats & Clark threads for all your quilting needs. With over 200 years of commitment to quality, selection, and innovation, Coats & Clark is the thread company trusted for generations.
All right, now that you have all of the sashing strips sewn between the blocks in each row, you should have 4 rows. I have rows 2, 3, and 4 on the wall, and row 1 is laying right here. Now we need that strip that goes in between the rows. And I've partially done these so that we can just save a little time, but you're going to add 1 square to 3 pieces. See, I've done it with 3, and then the 4th piece is just plain, and you're going to sew that together to make 1 long strip. So we're real close to sew the whole top together. We've got the rows all finished. We'll do this sashing strip that goes between the rows, get that sewn in, and then we'll be all done. I have a few tricks though I want to share with you on how to sew that long sashing strip in between the rows. Okay, I've taken one of the strips that have the sashing strips all sewn between them off the wall, and now I am going to pin in the long sashing strip that has the 3 squares in it. And you'll notice that the reason I didn't have you do a long strip that was just plain all the way across, and we could have done that, but I want to show you how we pin so that we use a positioning pin to be able to get these joints so that they will fall right next to one another. So I put a pin in to just hold it. Now, one of the things about pinning is when you put a pin in and you twist underneath, a lot of times you move that back fabric. So I put the pin in, and now I'm going to take a second pin and pin right next to it. Now I can take that pin out, and I'm going to do the same thing on the next one. I'm going to put a pin in, and you notice I'm doing these 1 layer at a time. I'm putting the pin in that one, and I'm putting a pin in the underneath one so that I can put it in at that 1/4 of an inch mark, which is what our seam allowance will be. And again, we will use the positioning pin to hold it. And we'll do that all the way along the strip. So once you have that all pinned, we're just going to sew this sashing strip that'll go right in between the rows. Now, from sewing this in, I can tell you that you want to press your seam allowances on this sashing so that the seam allowances goes toward the sashing strip, the green, because when you do that, you can nest those seams and you can see that you have perfect points where those come together. And now you can see that we're almost done. I have just one thing that I want to make sure that I point out to you. I'm looking at that design on the wall, and you can see those two center blocks are going in different directions. When you look at your handout, you're going to see that I put block A, sashing, block C, sashing, block C, turned. You need to pay attention to the directions and follow the diagram to make sure that you have that turned. And then we'll add another sashing and then the final block on the end. It's block B and block C that sometimes gets turned. So be sure you're watching your diagram, because otherwise you'll create a new design. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. If you decide you want to turn them a different direction, you certainly can do that. So we're almost finished now with our quilt top. And you and I both have some sewing to do before next week to get this all assembled. So don't forget to go register for the wonderful prizes that our sponsors are giving away at the end of this class. And you'll find that at quiltweek.com/Let's Quilt. Run those letters all together. And also there you will find the downloadable handout for today's lesson and an opportunity for you to join AQS at a special price, and it even comes with a special gift. So with that, we'll sign off here from Paducah, Quilt City, USA, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.